why do you think it is that machine learning, why terms like that, like gradient descent, and even programming in general, why do these things often seem so intimidating to people who haven't learned them already?
I think there's a few reasons, but when you talk about folks who are not familiar with this field, I think it's mostly a pop culture problem. So basically, I'll give you a good example of it. So when we imagine a piece of AI technology, we think of Jarvis from Iron Man, which is a very sophisticated piece of program. Now, when we think about this program, we're not thinking that it's built of a few layers, right? So when we imagine it as AI and we start thinking, how on earth, where are we even starting to build it from, right? This is where we struggle. Now,
Mhm.
the idea of programming is based on divide and conquer strategies. We're not thinking of something as a whole, but we're thinking of components, of the components that make up this entity. So, for example, if we take a look at Jarvis once again, it's an automated assistant that basically listens to what you tell and basically applies all the commands you give it. So the first layer of such a program would be analyzing the sound, recording sound, analyzing it, and translating it into text. Now, this is component one, and it's a piece of neural network on its own. That's an AI on its own. Now, basically, when you continue working on this program, that's where you take care of other components. So once you have translated it into text, then you can do some sentiment analysis on this text. I mean, what does this text mean? I have a collection of words here, but I don't know what they mean. I'm just this piece of program. So you need to train it to understand those words. Now, after it understands those words, you start working on another component, which basically applies the commands you've asked it to apply. So so basically, it's like an onion. There's plenty of layers involved.
Right.
And when people imagine programming, they think of the program as a whole. They imagine an entire social media network that was
Mm,
never built in a day. Now, what
right.
Facebook is today is not what Facebook was 12 years ago when they first started. You were not able to rent a house through Facebook. You were not able to engage in video conversations. You started from a very basic piece of software. And I think that the pop culture is what basically kind of presents us a much more glamorous reality than what it actually is, something a bit more sophisticated than what we are getting exposed to when we start learning programming.
I think you're right. I absolutely you took that answer in a very different direction than I would have thought of or anticipated, and
Yeah.
I think you're spot on. Like, yeah, talking about the complete system as being intimidating. But what I was imagining as intimidating is just it seems like the idea of writing code itself. When people see code and they've never written code before, even though to those of us who are already familiar with it, especially as you described Python as having so much syntax that is in plain English anyway, it's interesting how intimidating just looking at any code seems to be for the vast majority of people. Now, that plays to our advantage as people who have decided to learn how to deal with it. So,
Hmm.
you, me, most of our listeners probably have at some point gone over that hump, that intimidating hump of like, I'm going to learn how to do this. And you did it when you were 12. So maybe
Yeah.
you don't even really remember what it was like, or maybe you were never intimidated at all. Maybe you're just that kind of person. But I don't know. That's kind of what I imagine that there's this, even before people think about like, oh, how am I going to program this big system? It seems like people get caught at like the first hurdle. I think it's so great that you were able to have this inspiration of machine learning and AI and be like, oh, and that is coded in Python, and so therefore I'm going to start learning Python, and you just do it. But I think there's probably a lot of people out there, including maybe some listeners, who think, wow, data science, machine learning, AI, these are the coolest topics ever. They're going to make such a big impact in our lifetimes. And I can have a lucrative career if I go in this direction, but then have trouble getting started because they have trouble getting over that first hurdle of programming. So I don't know. I've been waffling here for a bit.
Yeah,
But
I can tell you that I'm a perfect example of what you just described. When I first took my first machine learning and deep learning course was absolutely horrific. I thought I'm not smart enough to understand any of it. I was struggling a lot. And for a very long time, I couldn't understand what those people want from me. Because I find that the way that they teach you is based upon prior knowledge. So you need to come with a certain set of terms that you already predefined, and based on those terms you can then learn the rest of it. So you need to have some kind of a background with analytics or programming or math, for example. Now, what is intimidating the most about it, is the way that it's being taught, is the sophisticated language that people usually use when they describe artificial intelligence, is all those formulas that you're presented with. So instead of showing you an example with the most basic piece of input and passing it through the most basic neural network, you're basically looking at all those complex formulas that are dealing with sets and limits and a lot of math concepts that are frankly not for beginners, not at all for beginners. Now, for a very long time, I thought that, well, maybe it's just not for me. Maybe I don't understand it well. Maybe something is wrong with me. And then I remember it was about a year after I took this course, and I was cursing for taking this course. I was like, oh, that's awful. Why did I do this to myself? I ended up taking a piece of paper and a pen, and instead of implementing everything with PyTorch or with a piece of machinery, I ended up manually implementing it. So I went for the math approach. I've selected the most basic piece of input, which was a list with 3 different floating point numbers, and I basically passed it through all the layers of a neural network. And I mean it both in terms of gradient descent and cross entropy and the fully connected layers. I've implemented manually all those things that I was theoretically thought on. And only then I actually understood what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I understood it, I also realized that it's so easy. I couldn't understand for a very long time why I'm struggling with it. And then I realized that it's not adjusted for a level that is suitable for beginners. And that's what I'm trying to solve. With all those videos that I'm filming, I'm trying to explain it in such a way that even a kid can understand. That's my goal. If I can explain it to a child, that means that I understand it myself. If I can't explain it to a child, it means that I'm using somebody else's terms. I'm using somebody else's
Mm-hmm.
fancy language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
It's Python
solvable.
simplified.
Yeah, absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
And this is perfect. You did take the bait there. That's how I was hoping you
Yeah.
would answer the question, and you did.
Yeah, you have to do it manually. Forget about computers. Just do it the old-fashioned way. If it worked for the smartest people on earth, it's going to work for you too, you know.
Yeah,
For
it
the
is interesting.
ancestors.
Neural networks or deep learning particularly seems intimidating to people, even people who are already familiar with some machine learning techniques, already familiar with programming. It seems like neural networks and deep learning is something that people really struggle with, and that's, I mean, part of why I created a lot of deep learning content. I think I have a similar pedagogical style to you. When I'm watching your videos, yeah, it resonates with me perfectly. You teach in the same way that I aspire to teach, and so that's part of why I was so excited to have you on the show.
Awesome.
Um, and yeah, it is really interesting once you break down, especially the forward pass of a neural network. So just going from after the neural network is already trained and it has its model weights, um, it's the math is actually really simple if you work through the numbers. And so breaking it down for people, yeah, it you can definitely do it. And so yeah, so listener, wherever you are in your data science or machine learning journey, um, just break it down. Watch some of Maria's videos. It
Yeah,
seems
and
like
take a piece
whatever.
of paper,
Yeah.
pen and paper. Forget about computers for just a little bit. And I think it brings us back to the principle of divide and conquer. Because when we look at this very bombastic algorithm of a neural network, we can break it down into some very simple math formulas in the end of the day.
Hmm.
The whole idea is just to understand the order in which we call those math operations
Hmm.
and the reason for which we need those operations to begin with. As long as, as beginners can master that, I think that gives you a very solid background to move on with a more sophisticated type of content that is not as simple as I I do it, but is very, very accurate.